A millionaire CEO called a cleaning lady to fire her, only to hear a little girl whisper 4 words that turned his entire world upside down. Ryan Holden began every morning the same way, with the sharp precision of a man who believed routine was the backbone of success. By 7:30 a.m., he was seated in his office on the top floor of the glass tower that carried his company's name, behind a polished mahogany desk that had seen hundreds of deals and decisions. He liked how the floor-to-ceiling windows made the city below look small and manageable, a quiet reminder that he held control over both his life and the empire he had built. Wearing a flawlessly tailored blue suit that cost more than what most people paid in rent, and with each hair carefully combed in place, he looked exactly as he wanted to. Untouchable, confident, and far too busy for anything except results. That morning, he was reviewing a merger presentation, making precise notes in the margins, while his assistant quietly added a fresh stack of documents at the edge of the desk. Ryan didn't look up. He rarely needed to. His employees had long since learned that he valued silence and competence above all else. He was mentally rehearsing how he would begin the afternoon's board meeting when the assistant paused just long enough to break his focus. When Ryan finally looked up, the young man was standing with his hands clasped together, clearly uncomfortable. That alone annoyed him. He hated disruptions to his schedule, especially on days packed with deadlines. He raised an eyebrow, wordlessly demanding an explanation. "Sir," the assistant said cautiously, "I'm sorry to interrupt with something this minor, but it seems Mrs. Brown, the cleaning lady assigned to this floor, hasn't shown up for the second day in a row." Ryan held back a sigh. With all the responsibilities he juggled, billions in revenue, hundreds of employees, a reputation that couldn't afford flaws, this barely seemed worth a moment of thought. Still, he didn't like the idea that anyone in his building might think showing up was optional. His entire career had been built on the belief that reliability was more important than talent. "Did she call in?" he asked, his tone firm but calm. "No, sir," the assistant replied, clearly uneasy. "And well, I thought maybe you'd want to decide if we should enter contract." Ryan shut the folder with a soft click and leaned back in his chair. Part of him wanted to brush it off entirely. He had never actually met Mrs. Brown. She was just one of the invisible gears keeping his office clean. But another, quieter part of him, the one he usually ignored, wondered why someone who'd never missed a day before would suddenly stop showing up with no explanation. He didn't really care why, but he did care about the example it would set if no one asked. "Give me her phone number," he said at last. The assistant looked surprised, but nodded and handed over a slip of paper. Ryan turned it between his fingers, looking at the neatly written numbers, then picked up the phone, feeling only a slight annoyance that this small issue was disrupting his morning. As he dialed, he told himself it would only take a minute. He'd ask for an explanation, give a warning, and move on to something that actually mattered. The phone rang. He was already preparing what to say, ready with the firm, distant tone he used with people who failed to meet expectations. But when the call finally connected, it wasn't a tired woman's voice he heard. It was the quiet, uncertain voice of a child, so soft he almost thought he misheard it. "Hello?" For a few moments, he was too stunned to speak. Ryan Holden always believed that staying in control began with perfect order. Even the smallest of details counted. That morning, like every other, he had arrived at his office before most of the city had even woken up. The elevator doors opened soundlessly on the top floor, revealing a hallway lined with glass walls and framed photos of construction sites he'd turned into landmarks. He passed by them without a glance, his mind fixed on the day ahead. His stride was steady and measured, already running through the key points he intended to highlight during the afternoon's investor meeting. He wore a sharply tailored blue suit that signaled both achievement and a careful distance. Everything about his appearance, from the crisp fold in his tie to the shine on his leather shoes, had been chosen to remind people that he didn't tolerate mistakes, excuses, or surprises. His office was spacious and filled with the cold light of a gray morning. The windows offered a sweeping view of the city skyline, but Ryan rarely looked out for long. He preferred focusing on the tasks before him. He placed his briefcase on the desk's corner and glanced at the organized stack of reports left by his assistant. Each file was color-coded, every section clearly labeled for review, exactly the way he liked things. He sat down, opened the top folder, and began reading, without even removing his coat. 15 minutes went by before he realized someone was quietly standing at his door. He slowly lifted his gaze, expecting to see his finance director or maybe the executive assistant who handled his calls. Instead, it was Peter, the young secretary who had only started a few months ago and still looked visibly nervous anytime Ryan spoke to him. Peter clutched a slim tablet to his chest like a shield and shifted uneasily from one foot to the other. Ryan found the sight more irritating than the interruption itself. He disliked people bringing problems without attempting to solve them first. "What is it?" he asked, his voice steady but edged with irritation. Peter cleared his throat and stepped in a little. "Sir, sorry to interrupt. It's about the cleaning staff. Mrs. Brown didn't show up for her shift again today." He paused, maybe hoping Ryan would wave it off, but Ryan simply narrowed his eyes slightly. Peter swallowed. It's the second day in a row. Ryan tapped his fingers once against the desk and thought. Mrs. Brown. He couldn't recall what she looked like. She was one of many employees he'd never met face to face, just a name on a payroll list, someone whose absence only got noticed when something went wrong. He disliked that he now knew her only because she had failed to show up. "Did she call in sick?" he asked. "No, sir," Peter replied, glancing down at the tablet in a way that made Ryan suspect he already expected to be told to terminate her. That would have been the easy route. Ryan had no tolerance for inconsistency. Still, something, a thought he couldn't quite define, made him pause. He wasn't sure why he cared enough to ask another question. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the discomfort of having his carefully maintained order disturbed. "Give me her number," he said finally. "I'll call her myself." Peter's eyebrows lifted slightly in surprise, but he nodded, tapped the tablet, and scribbled the number on a small piece of paper. Ryan waited until the door shut behind Peter before picking it up. He read the digits slowly, wondering why this felt like more than a minor annoyance. He reminded himself, this was just a routine matter. An absent worker, a call to set expectations, nothing more. He picked up the phone and dialed, rehearsing in his head the firm, composed lines he intended to use. The phone rang 3 times, then 4. He felt the first hint of irritation rising. Finally, the line clicked. Someone picked up. Ryan didn't wait for a greeting. "Mrs. Brown," he began, his voice already stern. "This is Ryan Holden. I'd like to know why you—" But the voice that interrupted him wasn't weary or apologetic, or even defensive. It was small, high-pitched, uncertain, so gentle that his carefully crafted reprimand vanished from his mind. "Hello?" said the tiny voice, so soft he wasn't sure he'd heard it right. For the first time in years, Ryan Holden had no prepared response. He couldn't speak for a second. The little voice on the other end was so faint and unsure that it didn't feel real. It wasn't the voice of a fearful employee used to disappointing a boss, nor was it the defensive tone of someone refusing to accept fault. It was just a child's voice, and it sounded like she'd been waiting a long time for someone to say something. He cleared his throat, trying to reassemble the words he'd planned, but none of them felt right anymore. This call wasn't about discipline or routine. It had suddenly become something else, something fragile and real. "Hello," he said at last. And even to himself, his voice sounded wrong. Too deep, too firm, too cold for the delicate tone she'd used. He tried again, gentler this time. "Can I speak to your mother?" There was a pause. He could almost imagine her clutching the phone with both tiny hands, wondering if she had done something wrong by answering. When she spoke again, the words came out in a single breath, as if she'd practiced them many times and was afraid to forget. "Mommy can't talk right now," she whispered. She's really sick." Something clenched in Ryan's chest. A feeling so unfamiliar he almost mistook it for anger. But it wasn't. It was something colder, clearer. The realization that all his drive for perfection had left no room to consider that someone's absence could mean something more than carelessness. He rubbed his forehead, reminding himself to stay composed. He'd handled high-stakes negotiations involving thousands of lives, but never had he been on a call with a child who sounded so small, so heartbreakingly steady. "What's your name?" he asked, because it was the only thing that felt appropriate. "Mia," she replied, almost too soft to hear. "I'm 6. There was another pause. He waited, resisting the urge to speak too soon. When she spoke again, her voice shook. "Mommy says she has to work, but she can't get up. I can come instead. If you need someone to clean." He shut his eyes for a moment, pressing the heel of his hand to his forehead. The thought of a little girl on her tiptoes, trying to grab cleaning supplies, formed so vividly in his mind that it made him feel unsteady. He inhaled slowly. "No," he said gently, as softly as he could manage. "No, Mia. That's very brave of you to offer. But you don't need to do that." "But we need money," she replied. And in those 4 quiet words, he heard more truth than he ever had in any boardroom. He thought of all the times he'd cut costs without thinking about whose lives were behind those numbers. Of all the times, he valued discipline more than compassion. He felt the burn of shame creeping up his neck. He'd been ready to dismiss a woman he'd never met because she missed 2 days, never once imagining there might be a little girl waiting behind a door, hoping her mother would get better. "I'm sorry," he said, and he wasn't even sure who the apology was for. Mia, her mother, or himself. "I shouldn't have raised my voice." "It's okay," she whispered, but they both knew. It wasn't. He swallowed, trying to find words that didn't sound empty. He had spent his entire life shaping the image of a man who never stumbled, never questioned, never allowed himself to feel more than necessary. But in that moment, listening to Mia's unsteady breathing, every one of his defenses gave way. "Deacon, you tell your mother she doesn't need to worry about work right now," he said at last. "And that I hope she gets well very soon." "Yes," Mia answered quietly. He thought he heard the faintest breath of relief, as if someone had finally noticed the weight she had been carrying alone. He paused, wanting to ask if she needed anything. But before he could speak again, the line went silent. She had hung up. He sat there for a long time, still holding the phone, staring at the documents he had been about to sign without hesitation. Suddenly, none of it felt important. He placed the receiver down slowly and leaned back in his chair, feeling something shift inside him. He knew then he couldn't just let this go. For the first time in years, he understood that the right thing wasn't the efficient one. It was the kind one. Ryan remained still for several minutes after Mia ended the call. One hand rested on the smooth surface of his desk, the polished wood cool beneath his fingers. Outside, the sky had lightened from gray to a pale blue, but he hardly noticed. He couldn't stop hearing Mia's small, determined voice. "I can come instead if you need someone to clean." The quiet strength it must have taken for a child to offer that solution cut straight through every wall he had built over the years. For so long, he had judged people by their performance, how they kept his world running smoothly. But now, all he could see was a little girl beside her sick mother, gripping the phone with both hands, hoping she hadn't done something wrong by answering. He pushed his chair back and stood, rolling his shoulders like he was trying to shake off the weight pressing on them. But it stayed right there, deep in his chest. He could have asked someone from HR to handle the situation, to call social services, to file the proper forms for medical leave. That would have been efficient. That would have been professional. But the idea of handing it off made him feel like a coward, like he was avoiding the human cost of the choices he made every single day. He'd never thought of himself as unkind, but he definitely taught himself to stay detached. He told himself that was necessary to stay sharp, to make tough decisions. Now, he wondered if that detachment had turned into something smaller, something colder, something that made it too easy to forget people had lives beyond office walls. He picked up his phone again, this time to call his assistant. Peter answered right away, sounding nervous. "Yes, sir?" Ryan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The pressure in his chest left no room for impatience. "Cancel all of my appointments today. Move everything to tomorrow." There was silence on the line. Ryan could almost hear Peter trying to figure out if he'd heard right. Ryan had never once canceled an entire day without a serious emergency. "Sir, should I?" Peter began. But Ryan cut him off gently. "No, just reschedule. I'm leaving the building for the rest of the day." He hung up before more questions could come. Moving on instinct, not some carefully laid plan. He pulled on his coat and walked out of the office without speaking to anyone. The elevator ride down felt like forever. He stood alone, watching the floor numbers tick lower, each one bringing him farther from the version of himself who would have considered a mother's absence just another problem to fix. By the time he reached the lobby, he knew exactly where he was headed, even if he still wasn't sure what he'd say once he got there. He drove himself, skipped the usual company car that usually ferried him between appointments. He didn't want anyone else involved. He needed to see it for himself, to understand why Mia's voice had struck him so deeply. The neighborhood sat on the city's edge, where buildings were older and sidewalks cracked from too many winters without repairs. He parked in front of a narrow brick apartment building. The window frames were chipped and the paint was peeling. For a few seconds, he sat in the car with his hands still on the steering wheel, feeling like he didn't belong. He had spent his life making sure he would never belong in places like this. But here he was. He climbed the steps slowly. He had to stop and squint at the door numbers. None of them were clearly marked. The hallway smelled faintly of old coffee and cleaning supplies. And for some reason, that tiny detail made something twist in his chest. He found the right door and stood there, uncertain for the first time in years about how to introduce himself. His knuckles hovered near the wood, but he didn't knock right away. Instead, he took a long breath, trying to push down every urge to fix or correct. He needed to be something else today. Someone else. Finally, he knocked, softly, listening closely for any sound inside. At first, there was nothing. Then came the light sound of footsteps. So soft, he instantly knew it had to be Mia. The door cracked open a few inches. She looked up at him, her wide blue eyes staring from her small pale face. She wore a pink dress with a bow at the collar, and her blonde curls were held back by a worn headband. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He suddenly realized how strange he must look to her. This tall man in a sharp suit, standing in her doorway for no obvious reason. She tilted her head slightly, her expression wary but curious. "You're the man from Mommy's work?" she asked. Her voice was even softer than on the phone. He felt something twist inside him. "Yes," he replied, surprised by how unsteady his voice sounded. "My name is Ryan. May I come in?" Mia peeked over her shoulder, maybe to see if her mother would object, but no reply came from inside. After a moment, she stepped aside and opened the door wider. As he stepped in, he felt her small hand brush against his coat. The air inside was warm and smelled faintly of tea and something floral he couldn't quite place. The apartment was small, but neat. In the corner, he saw a narrow bed. On it lay a woman, propped up with thin pillows. Mrs. Brown looked even paler than he'd imagined, her features strained with exhaustion and discomfort. She slowly turned her head to see him. Her eyes were tired, though she tried to pull her expression into something close to polite. "Mr. Holden," she whispered, I'm sorry. I didn't expect you to come." He took a slow step forward, stopping at the foot of the bed. He wasn't ready for how frail she looked. All the words he thought he might say vanished. What remained was the truth. He was here because the thought of Mia facing this alone was unbearable. Ryan stood in the small living room, feeling more like an intruder than the man who signed hundreds of paychecks every month. He had walked into countless offices and boardrooms with full confidence. But here, with a worn rug under his shoes and the soft smell of ointment in the air, his usual calm began to crack. Mrs. Brown's thin hands rested over the blanket. She tried to lift them, maybe to fix her hair or move her pillow, but didn't seem to have the strength. Everything about her seemed so small. Her wrists, the hollows in her cheeks, the tired and almost apologetic way she looked at him, as if she was the one at fault. He cleared his throat, not to speak, but to steady himself. He had spent years becoming someone who never showed weakness, who never let emotions get in the way of decisions. But right now, none of that seemed worth protecting. Mia stood quietly at her mother's side, one hand gently resting on the bed frame. She watched Ryan with a seriousness far too heavy for someone her age. He wanted to say something kind to her, something to ease the worry on her face, but his mind had gone blank. Stripped of all the rehearsed lines he used for difficult meetings. "I just wanted to check on you," he finally said, and even he was surprised by how strange the words sounded in his voice. "When no one heard from you, I thought I should see for myself." He suddenly noticed he was gripping the back of a nearby chair. His palms were damp. Mrs. Brown closed her eyes briefly, her breath catching in her throat before she spoke again. "I didn't want to cause any trouble," she said, her voice so faint he had to lean in to hear her. "I thought if I could just rest for a few days, I'd be able to return to work and no one would need to know." She opened her eyes and looked up at him, her expression filled with a quiet sadness that made his chest feel hollow. "But I can't even stand for more than a minute," she added. "I don't know what we're going to do." Ryan looked over at Mia, who shifted slightly, as though preparing herself to be scolded or blamed. Instead, he pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat down, not caring that his suit wrinkled beneath him. None of that mattered here. Not his tailored clothing, not his status. He folded his hands in his lap, trying to find the right way to show he hadn't come to criticize. He studied Mrs. Brown's face, noticing how often her eyes flicked to Mia, more worried about her daughter's feelings than her own illness. "Mia told me you were sick," he said at last. He saw her shoulders pull inward under the blanket, like she was ashamed to have made her daughter carry that burden. "I'm sorry I raised my voice," he continued, knowing the words weren't nearly enough. "I didn't understand what was going on. You didn't have to come," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I know you're very busy. I didn't expect, but I did come," he said, interrupting gently, his voice quiet but final. Even he was surprised by the firmness of it. He turned to Mia, who was standing very still, her eyes wide. "And I'm glad I came." For a few seconds, the room was silent. The only sound the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. He looked around and noticed how clean everything was despite her illness. Folded laundry neatly stacked in a basket, a few rinsed cups drying on the counter. That quiet order told him she was someone who had spent her life caring for others without expecting help in return. The thought that she had tried to keep working, even when she could barely stand, simply because she thought no one would ask. It hit him hard. He looked back at her and spoke with more weight in his voice now. "You don't have to worry about your job," he said, choosing each word carefully so she'd understand he meant it. "You'll have the time you need to get better, and I'll make sure you have what you need in the meantime." Her lips parted like she wanted to object, but all that came out was a soft exhale, and then tears welled in her eyes. She looked down, blinking rapidly. But the tears slid down her cheeks anyway. Mia stepped closer, reaching for her mother's hand. Her small fingers curled around her mom's limp ones. Ryan looked at that gentle connection, and something settled deep inside him. He knew he wouldn't just walk away from this. When Mrs. Brown finally looked back up, she said, "I don't want charity," though it sounded more like a plea than a protest. He shook his head softly. "It's not charity," he replied. "It's the least I can do. No one should have to face this kind of thing alone." Mia looked up at him, searching his face like she was trying to figure out if he was really telling the truth. He held her gaze, steady and calm. After a moment, she rested, her cheek on her mother's shoulder, her face softening. The quiet trust in that simple gesture made his chest tighten, and he had to look away, clearing his throat. In that moment, he realized he had never felt more certain about anything in his life. He couldn't just treat this as another problem, to delegate or forget. He had come here to do the right thing, but now he understood. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Ryan stayed far longer than he'd expected. The light in the living room shifted from the dull gray of morning to the soft gold of afternoon. He stopped noticing the time, or the constant buzz of his phone, or the meetings he was supposed to be leading. None of it mattered here. He hadn't arrived with a plan, but he quickly learned plans meant nothing to him now. He just needed to understand what this family had been going through, to truly see it, not imagine it as a line in a report. He asked simple questions, keeping his tone gentle. Mrs. Brown explained slowly how the illness had crept in during the winter, how she had kept going as long as she could, scared of losing her job and the little bit of security it gave them. She told him about the week she could barely stand, but still worked until she collapsed in the hallway. Even as she talked, she kept checking Mia's face, trying to gauge how much her daughter could bear. He could see how much effort it took for her to pretend everything would be fine. How hard she'd worked to shield Mia from the worst of it, even though Mia clearly knew the truth. He watched the little girl's face as she listened. Her expression didn't change much, but her hand never left her mother's arm. It struck him then just how brave she had been, braver than a child should ever have to be. He felt it like a heavy stone in his chest. After a while, Mrs. Brown's voice grew weaker, and she closed her eyes. Mia reached for a glass of water and offered it with both hands. Ryan got up to help, steadying the glass while Mrs. Brown sipped. When she lay back again, her breathing sounded easier. She opened her eyes, looking embarrassed. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I get tired so quickly." "You don't need to apologize," he said, and he meant it more deeply than he expected. "You don't owe me an explanation." Mia studied him then. Her blue eyes watched him with a focus that made him feel unexpectedly exposed. He wondered if she was deciding whether he could be trusted, or if he was just another adult who'd leave when things got difficult. He knew that look. He'd seen it in people who once relied on him, employees, investors, people who believed in his promises. He had grown used to disappointment, but the idea of Mia having to learn that same disappointment, that he couldn't bear. He looked around the room, at the tidy piles of clothes, the small bookshelf of children's stories, the single vase of wilted daisies. All of it showed how hard they'd tried to create some kind of normal, even in such difficult circumstances. He turned back to Mia. "Can I ask you something?" he said quietly. She nodded. "How are you doing?" It was such a simple question, but it made her eyebrows crease, like she hadn't heard it in a long time. She hesitated, parted her lips slightly, and then shrugged, her shoulders lifting and falling in a tiny, helpless gesture. "I'm okay," she whispered, but her voice sounded older than it should have, and something about it made his throat tighten. He cleared his throat, leaned forward, and rested his forearms on his knees. "I'm going to help your mom," he said, and he knew, even as the words left his mouth, that it wasn't just a promise. It was a decision, a commitment, one he would keep. She won't have to worry about work or money for now. And you won't have to worry about her getting worse because she has to work. Mia blinked at him, her eyes wide. "You can do that?" she asked, her voice small. He nodded. "Yes," he replied softly. She didn't exactly smile, but she released a long, quiet breath, like she'd been holding it in for days. Then she turned to glance at her mother, who was watching them with a tired awe, like she couldn't quite believe she wasn't facing this struggle alone anymore. For a while, nobody said anything. The silence felt different now. Less heavy, more like the slow arrival of hope. Ryan leaned back slightly, finally allowing himself to relax in a way he hadn't in a long time. He didn't leave their apartment until the sky outside had turned dusky and dark. The city beyond the window looked cold and distant compared to the warmth he'd experienced in that small room. For the first time in his adult life, he didn't want to return to his pristine penthouse, where no one waited for him. As he descended the narrow staircase, he replayed every word Mia and her mother had said, each sentence carving itself deeper into his thoughts. By the time he reached his car, he knew there was no going back. He couldn't pretend that his concern was just professional. He had crossed a quiet boundary the moment he sat beside Mrs. Brown's bed, and he no longer wished to step back. Once home, he didn't turn on the lights. Instead, he sat in the silence, his phone in hand, staring at the screen as if it might tell him what to do next. He thought about the way Mia had looked at him when she asked if he could really help. He remembered the sound of relief in Mrs. Brown's voice when she finally believed he meant it. He recalled how easily he'd dismissed the personal struggles of thousands in the past, brushing them off as someone else's burden. It was much harder now to see those choices as merely efficient. He had always believed that keeping a distance made him stronger. But tonight, he felt how empty that distance truly was. He barely slept. By dawn, he was already at his desk drafting a list of things that needed to be done. Scheduling a medical visit for Mrs. Brown, setting up grocery deliveries, approving a large advance payment to cover her bills. He called Margaret, his longtime company attorney, and told her everything. She listened with her usual calm, composed tone. But when he described how Mia had answered the phone, alone in the apartment, there was a noticeable pause. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentler than usual. "Ryan, this really isn't your responsibility," she said carefully. He rubbed his forehead, feeling the familiar ache from lack of sleep. "I know it's not," he said, "but it feels like it is." He heard her sigh, as though deciding whether to push back. "All right," she finally said. "Then let's make sure it's handled the right way." After ending the call, he felt a sense of calm. He wasn't doing this alone, and that helped untangle some of the confusion he felt. Later that morning, he drove back to their apartment without overthinking it. He brought a bag of groceries himself. Sending an assistant just didn't feel right. When he knocked, Mia opened the door with a look of shy anticipation. She was nervously tugging at the hem of her pink dress. He noticed she had taken time to brush her curls and was wearing clean white socks pulled high, like she'd gotten ready especially for him. Her mother was awake, sitting up with more pillows. She still looked pale but more alert than the last time. When she saw him holding the grocery bag, her eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away. He set the bag down on the counter and sat without waiting for permission. Mrs. Brown mentioned how much she missed working, how it helped her feel needed. Ryan mostly listened, making sure not to show any impatience when she apologized over and over for needing support. He tried to explain that he didn't see it as charity, that anyone with the means should do the same. But even as he said it, he knew there was more to it than that. This was personal now. At one point, Mia climbed up onto the couch beside him, sitting so close that her shoulder touched his arm. She didn't say anything, but the trust in her quiet closeness meant more than words. He looked down and saw her studying the cuff of his jacket, like she'd never seen someone in a suit up close. Her mother noticed, a tired smile appearing on her lips. "She's been talking about you," she said softly. "I think she's decided you're safe." He swallowed hard, feeling how much that simple comment meant, especially coming from a child who had clearly learned to be careful with her hope. By the time he left, he had already arranged for a visiting nurse and ensured they had everything they'd need for the week. As he stood at the door, one hand on the frame, a strange hesitation came over him. Like stepping back into the hallway would mean leaving something important behind. Mia stepped in front of him, tilting her face up toward his. "Will you come back?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't let himself pause. "Yes," he said simply. "I'll come back." When she nodded and stepped away, he realized just how easy it would be to keep that promise, and how unbearable it would feel to ever break it. The next week passed like he was living between two lives. During the day, Ryan returned to the usual grind. Meetings, reports, and video calls that used to define him. He sat at boardroom tables while others presented slides, nodding in all the right places. But mentally, he was somewhere else. Even as he made major decisions, his thoughts kept drifting back to that small apartment, to Mrs. Brown's quiet strength and Mia's growing trust. Each night, he came home carrying their faces in his memory and a heaviness in his chest that felt both painful and full. He tried telling himself this was temporary, just helping them through a rough patch. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. There was nothing short-term about how he felt when he heard Mia's joyful, "Hi," or when Mrs. Brown looked at him with disbelief that someone kept showing up. He had built his life around keeping people at a safe distance, but for the first time, he didn't want to anymore. He started forming little habits during his visits. Mondays, he brought groceries. Thursdays, he brought books for Mia. Saturday mornings, he picked up fresh pastries from a nearby bakery, smiling inside when Mia clapped her hands with delight. Sometimes he stayed for an hour, sometimes longer. He'd sit on the couch with tea that Mrs. Brown made herself once she felt strong enough, and they'd talk about things that had nothing to do with illness. She asked about his life, real questions, and when he told her about his parents, about growing up without much and working for everything, she listened in a way no one else ever had. One evening, as twilight painted the windows dark, Mia crawled up next to him with her coloring book. She opened to a blank page, held out a pink crayon, and looked at him with focus and determination. "You can color with me," she said. She said it like it was the most natural thing in the world, and he found himself smiling. He couldn't recall the last time someone had invited him to do something so simple. He accepted the crayon and began coloring in the petals of a flower as she watched him closely, nodding in approval. When they finished, she inspected their work and declared, "It's perfect." He was caught off guard by how proud he felt from receiving praise from a child. That same evening, after Mia had gone to her room to store away her drawings, Mrs. Brown spoke. Her voice was steady, though quiet. "You've already done more than anyone would expect," she said, her eyes fixed on him like she was trying to understand why. "I keep thinking you'll feel like it's enough and just stop coming." He couldn't respond right away. That same question had haunted him at night, why he kept returning, why it mattered so deeply. But when he tried imagining stepping away, letting their story become just another memory, he felt a cold finality he couldn't live with. He shook his head slowly. "I'm not going to stop," he told her, surprised at the strength in his voice. "Not if you'll allow me to keep being here." Her expression softened. She lowered her eyes to her hands, which she twisted nervously in her lap. "It's been a long time since anyone's meant that," she admitted. He felt a deep, quiet ache watching her struggle to accept kindness without shame. He wished there was something, anything he could say to make her believe she deserved support, simply for trying so hard to hold everything together. After that night, something shifted in how they spoke to one another. The formality dissolved. Silences no longer carried discomfort. He found something he'd been missing without realizing: belonging. When he arrived, Mia would throw her arms around him without hesitation, and when he left, Mrs. Brown would walk him to the door, lifting her hand in a gentle wave that felt more honest than any boardroom goodbye. One morning, while unpacking groceries in their kitchen, he realized something startling. This small, imperfect home had become the only place where he didn't feel like he had to perform. He didn't have to play the role of a CEO, a figure of control or perfection. He could just be a man doing the right thing for people who now felt like part of his life. And though he hadn't yet said it aloud, he knew he didn't want that to change. The day Ryan finally admitted to himself that this wasn't temporary began like countless others, with him standing in his kitchen, staring into a mug of cold coffee, thinking about Mia and her mother. He'd woken before dawn with a restlessness he couldn't name. He knew, deep down, it was because he was tired of living in two separate worlds. One foot in his familiar routine, the other rooted in that apartment. Every time he left their home, he carried an ache in his chest, a sense that something important was unfinished. He would walk into his silent, spotless penthouse, drop his keys on the marble counter, and feel that old emptiness settle back in. That morning, he set aside his untouched coffee and recognized the choice before him. Either step away and let them return to their lives, or step in, fully and without hesitation. The clarity of what he wanted startled him. He didn't want to let them go. He wanted to stay. He arrived later than usual that day, weighed down by what he was about to say. When Mia opened the door, her smile lit up instantly, and it struck him how much she already expected him to be there. She no longer looked surprised to see him. She looked reassured, like a part of her had always feared today might be the day he stopped showing up. Before he could even set down the groceries, she wrapped her arms around his waist and rested, her head against his stomach. He gently placed his hand on her head, recognizing the familiar softness of her curls. Curls he could now pick out in any crowd. That small gesture grounded him more than anything else could have. Mrs. Brown was sitting in her armchair by the window, a loose sweater draped over her narrow shoulders. She looked stronger than she had in the beginning, though still frail, and her smile carried both gratitude and uncertainty. He placed the grocery bags on the table and took the seat across from her. For a moment, he simply looked at her, and perhaps sensing the weight of what he'd come to say, she waited in silence. Mia slipped into the chair beside him, her small fingers wrapping around his hand like they'd always belonged there. Mia inhaled deeply, steadying himself. "I've been thinking about this a lot," he began, and the truth echoed in his voice. "I came here at first because I thought it was the right thing to do, because I couldn't get that phone call out of my head." He looked down at Mia, whose wide eyes watched him intently, then turned back to Mrs. Brown. "But it's more than that now," he said after a pause, reaching for words he'd never had to speak before. "I care about you both, and not in a way that I can walk away from." Mrs. Brown opened her mouth slightly, but no words came. Mia leaned in closer, her grip tightening around his hand. He exhaled slowly, letting the truth settle between them. "I don't have all the answers," he admitted. "I don't know exactly what this means yet, but I want to be here, not just to bring groceries or call doctors. I want to be part of your lives if you'll let me." Silence followed. The old clock on the shelf ticked softly, counting the seconds while Mrs. Brown's eyes brimmed with tears she made no effort to hide. "Ryan," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't even know what to say. No one has ever offered us anything like this." He gently shook his head. "You don't need to say anything right now. I just needed you to know. Then Mia spoke, so quietly he almost missed it. Does that mean you could be our family? The word landed with a weight that made his heart twist. He turned to her and placed a gentle hand against her cheek. If you'll have me, he said softly, I'd be honored to be your family. Mrs. Brown covered her mouth as a sob escaped. Mia climbed into his lap without hesitation, wrapping her arms around his neck. He held her close, feeling her warmth and the quiet rhythm of her heartbeat against his chest. And in that moment, nothing else, no wealth, no title, no reputation, could match the overwhelming, humbling rightness he felt. Later, as Mia dozed off in his arms, Mrs. Brown whispered again, this time with the rawness of someone laying bare a lifetime of exhaustion. I don't know how I'll ever repay you for this. He didn't take his eyes off Mia. You don't have to repay me, he said quietly. I want this. All of it. She closed her eyes, and he watched as the burden she'd carried for so long seemed to finally ease. For the first time, she allowed herself to rest. That night, as he rose to leave, Mia stirred awake and lifted her head sleepily. You'll come back tomorrow? She asked. He leaned in and kissed her hair. Tomorrow, he said, and every day after that. He meant it, deeply, completely. It was a promise he knew he would never break. As he stepped into the quiet hallway, he felt something shift inside. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. He now understood that the life he had been building, shiny, structured, and cold, was only a shell, and that the real life, the one that mattered, was waiting behind a simple door. A life with a little girl who believed he'd keep his promises. This ending is powerful not because it's grand or dramatic, but because it's rooted in small, deeply human choices. Showing up, listening, letting go of pride, allowing himself to be needed. Ryan didn't become some savior. He simply let himself feel, let himself connect, and discovered that real love, messy, honest, and freely given, can become the strongest foundation of all. That final image, him stepping into the hallway, certain that he finally belongs, doesn't just end the story. It lingers.